My adopted daughter told the lawyer, "You can skip the reading, I already know what's in it." My wife Helen died on a Tuesday after 3 years of fighting cancer. We had been married for 31 years. We had 2 children together. Our son Brian, who was 28 and worked as an electrician. Our daughter Wendy, whom we adopted when she was 4 years old and who was now 30 and worked as absolutely nothing. Wendy had not worked a single day in her entire adult life. She said working was beneath her. She said she was meant for better things. She said that when Helen and I died, she would inherit everything, and then she could live the life she deserved. She said this to our faces at Thanksgiving dinner 2 years ago. She said it like it was a fact, like the weather, like the sun rising in the east. Helen and I had built a decent life. We owned our house outright. We had savings and investments. We had a vacation property up by the lake that had been in Helen's family for generations. It wasn't a fortune, but it was comfortable. It was enough to make someone like Wendy feel entitled to do nothing while waiting for us to die. When Helen got sick, Wendy did not help. She did not come to appointments. She did not bring meals. She did not sit with her mother during chemotherapy. She said hospitals made her uncomfortable. She said she would be there for the important moments. She showed up at the very end when Helen had hours left. She showed up with a notebook and asked Helen where the safe deposit box key was. Helen was too weak to respond. I told Wendy to get out. She said she was just being practical. Brian was there every week. Brian took time off work to drive his mother to radiation. Brian held her hand, told her stories, and made her laugh even when laughing hurt. Brian never once asked about money or inheritance or what he might get when this was over. The funeral was on a Friday. Wendy wore a red dress because she said black was too depressing. She complained that the flowers were cheap. She asked me during the reception how long it would take to process the will. I told her to show some respect. She said she was just asking a question. The lawyer called us in for the reading of the will the following week. Brian came in his work clothes because he'd taken a half day and didn't want to miss more than necessary. Wendy came in. She sat down, crossed her legs, and looked at the lawyer like he was wasting her time. That's when she said it. "You can skip the reading. I already know what's in it." The lawyer, whose name was Gerald, looked at her and then looked at me. I nodded for him to continue. He read the will out loud just like he was supposed to. Helen had left everything to me as the surviving spouse. The house, the savings, the lake property, everything. This was normal and expected because we had always planned that whoever survived would get everything and then decide how to distribute it to the children later. Wendy sat up straighter in her chair. "What about when he dies? What does his will say?" Gerald explained that my will was not relevant to this meeting. Wendy turned to me with her eyes wide. "But I'm getting everything right. When you die, everything comes to me." I asked her why she thought that. She said because she was the oldest. She said that because she had been part of this family longer than Brian. She said because Helen had always promised her that she would be taken care of. I told her that being taken care of and getting everything were 2 very different things. She started talking faster. She said that she had been counting on this. She said that she had made plans. She said that her boyfriend, Dustin, was expecting them to buy a house together, and she had promised him that the money was coming. I asked her what money she thought was coming. She said all of it. She said the house was worth at least $400,000. She said the lake property was worth another $200,000. She said the savings had to be at least $100,000 more. I let her finish talking. Then I told her what Helen and I had decided together before she died. Brian was getting the lake property because he had earned it with his love and his presence and his dedication to his mother. I was keeping the house because I intended to live in it until I died. The savings would go toward my retirement and my care, and whatever was left would be split between them when I was gone. But Wendy had a condition attached to her portion. She had to get a job and keep it for 5 years. Any job. Full-time. If she couldn't prove employment for 5 consecutive years, she got nothing, and her share went to Brian. Wendy's face went through several colors. She went white first, like all the blood drained straight out of her face. Then red crept up from her neck, spreading across her cheeks in blotches. Finally, purple, this deep, angry color that made the veins in her forehead stand out. She pushed her chair back so hard it tipped over backward and slammed into the bookshelf behind her. 3 heavy law books tumbled off the shelf and hit the floor with loud thuds. Brian jumped in his seat. Gerald's pen clattered onto his desk. Wendy started screaming about how this was illegal, how I couldn't just put conditions on her money like I was some kind of king making rules. Her voice got higher and louder with each word. Gerald waited for her to take a breath, then spoke in this calm, quiet voice that somehow cut through all her noise. He explained that parents can absolutely attach reasonable conditions to money they leave their children. He said employment requirements are actually pretty common for adult children who haven't shown they can handle money responsibly. He said he'd written dozens of wills with similar conditions, and courts uphold them all the time. Wendy spun around to face Brian. She pointed her finger at him and said he needed to talk sense into me, that siblings are supposed to stick together against unfair parents. Brian had been sitting there quiet through the whole thing, just watching. Now he looked right at her, didn't blink or look away. He said he thought the condition was completely fair. He said she hadn't worked a single day in 12 years. He said Mom died exhausted, and one of the things that wore her out was worrying about what would happen to Wendy after we were gone. His voice stayed level and calm, but I could hear the anger underneath it. Wendy made this sound like a wounded animal. She grabbed her purse off the floor and stormed toward the door. She yanked it open so hard the frosted glass in the frame rattled and shook. I thought it might crack. The door slammed behind her with a bang that echoed through the whole office. Through the window, I watched her march across the parking lot in her high heels, wobbling a little on the uneven pavement. She got into her car and reversed out of the space without looking, tires squealing. Another car had to brake hard to avoid hitting her. She didn't even slow down, just pulled onto the street and disappeared. Gerald picked up the law books from the floor and put them back on the shelf. He straightened some papers on his desk. Then he looked at Brian and me and said we should go ahead and finish the paperwork while we were all here. We spent the next 20 minutes signing forms and going over details about transferring the lake property into Brian's name and handling the estate accounts. Gerald mentioned he'd seen plenty of families fight over money after someone died. He said most of the time the fights got ugly and nobody won. He told us he respected that Helen and I had tried to use the inheritance as a way to help Wendy instead of just punishing her, even if she couldn't see it that way right now. He said sometimes people need time to calm down and think clearly. When we left the office, Brian walked me to my car in the parking lot. He asked if I wanted him to follow me home. I said I was fine, but he shook his head and said he was following me anyway. The drive took 15 minutes and I watched his truck in my rearview mirror the whole way. When I pulled into my driveway, he pulled in right behind me. We sat there in our vehicles for a minute, then both got out at the same time. We ended up sitting on the front porch steps even though it was chilly out. Brian talked about Helen and how she always knew the right thing to say when Wendy got upset. He said Mom had this way of being firm but kind at the same time, setting boundaries without making people feel attacked. I told him I didn't have that gift, that I just got angry when Wendy acted entitled and selfish. Brian said maybe that was okay, that maybe Wendy needed someone to be angry instead of always understanding. We sat there for half an hour just talking, watching cars drive by on the street. Finally, Brian said he needed to get back to work, that he'd already taken more time off than he planned. He hugged me before he left, which we don't do often, and told me to call if I needed anything. I went inside and made coffee I didn't drink. I sat at the kitchen table and tried to read the newspaper but couldn't focus on the words. Around 5 o'clock, my phone started ringing. Wendy's name lit up the screen. I let it go to voicemail. She called back 2 minutes later. Voicemail again, then again, and again. Over the next 2 hours, she called 17 times. I didn't answer any of them. After the call stopped, I listened to the voicemails. The first few were her crying and saying she couldn't believe I would do this to her. Then they got angry, her voice sharp and accusing, saying I'd betrayed her and ruined her life. The middle ones were desperate, begging me to reconsider, promising she'd be better and do whatever I wanted. The last few got manipulative, talking about how Helen would be so disappointed in me for treating her daughter this way, how I was destroying our family over money. I deleted them all and turned my phone on silent. The next morning, someone knocked on my door at 7 o'clock. I was still in my bathrobe drinking coffee. I looked through the peephole and saw Dustin standing on my porch. He was wearing expensive jeans and a leather jacket, his hair styled with gel. I opened the door but left the screen door latched. He started talking immediately, his voice loud and aggressive. He said I'd destroyed their plans, that Wendy was devastated and it was my fault. He said they were supposed to buy a house together, and now that was ruined because I was being cruel and controlling. He kept saying Wendy was a good person who deserved better than this treatment. His face was red, and he kept stepping closer to the screen door like he wanted to push through it. I told him that if he really loved Wendy, he should encourage her to get a job instead of sitting around waiting for people to die so she could take their money. I said a real partner would want to build a life together through work and effort, not inheritance. He called me a heartless bastard and said I didn't understand anything about their relationship. Then he turned and walked back to his car. I noticed the car for the first time. It was a luxury sports car, something German with a price tag probably around $60,000. The paint was perfect and the rims were custom. I wondered what Dustin actually did for work and why, if he could afford a car like that, He needed Wendy's inheritance money to buy a house. Something didn't add up, but I was too tired to figure it out. That evening, Brian showed up with Chinese food in paper bag. He said he figured I wasn't eating properly, and he was right. I hadn't eaten anything except toast since the will reading. We sat at the kitchen table where Helen used to do her crossword puzzles every morning. The spot where her coffee mug always sat was empty, and it hurt to look at it. Brian unpacked containers of fried rice and orange chicken and egg rolls. We ate quietly for a while. Then he told me he was proud of how I was handling everything with Wendy, even though he knew it was hard. He said it took guts to stick to the plan instead of giving in when she cried and yelled. I told him I wasn't sure if I was being strong or just stubborn. He said maybe they were the same thing sometimes. 2 days later, Wendy showed up at my door holding a piece of paper. She waved it in my face like it was some kind of trophy. She said she had a job application, and she was taking this seriously. I took the paper from her hand and looked at it. It was an application for a retail store downtown. The paper was crisp and clean. Too clean. I looked closer and saw that every single line was blank. She had not filled out her name. She had not written her address or phone number. She had not checked any boxes or signed anything. She had downloaded the form from the internet and printed it out and brought it to me like that proved something. I asked her if she planned to actually fill it out and turn it in. She said she was going to do that next. She said she just wanted to show me she was trying. I told her that printing a blank application was not trying. She said I was being unfair. I told her that submitting one application would not cut it anyway. The will required 5 years of steady work. That meant finding a job she could actually keep. That meant showing up every day even when she did not feel like it. That meant dealing with bosses and coworkers and customers even when they annoyed her. One application to one store was not going to make any of that happen. She needed to think about what kind of work she could actually stand doing for 5 years straight. Wendy's face got red. She grabbed the paper back from me and crumpled it up. She threw it at my chest and it bounced off and landed on the floor. She said I was impossible to please. She said nothing she did would ever be good enough for me. She said I had already made up my mind to give everything to Brian, and this was just a game to torture her. Then she turned and walked out. She slammed the door hard enough that the picture frames on the wall rattled. I picked up the crumpled application and threw it in the trash. I thought about calling her back, but I did not. She needed to figure this out on her own. 3 days after that, Gerald called me. His voice sounded tired. He said Wendy had contacted him directly. She wanted to know if there were any loopholes in the will conditions. She asked if she could challenge the employment requirement in court. She wanted to know if there was any way to get her inheritance without actually having to work for 5 years. Gerald told her the will was airtight. He said Helen and I had it reviewed by 2 other lawyers before she signed it. They had looked for any possible legal problems. They made sure everything was clear and enforceable. Gerald said Wendy asked a lot of questions about what counted as employment. Could she work part-time? Could she start her own business and pay herself? Could she volunteer somewhere and call that a job? He told her the will specified full-time employment with a legitimate employer who would provide documentation. He said she seemed frustrated when he explained all this. She asked him whose side he was on. He told her he was not on anyone's side. He was just doing his job as the executor of Helen's estate. After I hung up with Gerald, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I thought about Wendy looking for loopholes instead of just getting a job. I thought about how much energy she was putting into avoiding work when she could use that same energy to actually work. The grief was getting harder to handle. I thought losing Helen would get easier with time, but it was not working that way. Every morning I woke up and reached for her side of the bed and she was not there. Every evening I came home and the house was quiet in a way that felt wrong. Brian was helping, but he had his own life. I could not lean on him for everything. I needed to talk to someone who understood what I was going through. I found a grief counselor named Carrie Jennings. Her office was in a small building near the library. The waiting room had soft chairs and tissues on every table. Carrie was in her 50s with gray hair and kind eyes. She did not try to tell me everything would be okay. She just listened. I told her about Helen. I told her about the cancer and the 3 years of fighting and how tired Helen was at the end. I told her about Wendy and the will and the conditions. I told her I felt guilty for being so hard on my daughter when I should be focused on missing my wife. Carrie said grief and family conflict could happen at the same time. She said dealing with Wendy's behavior did not mean I loved Helen any less. She helped me understand that setting boundaries with Wendy was actually an act of love. It felt cruel to make her work for her inheritance. It felt mean to watch her struggle and not just give her the money. But Carrie said giving Wendy money without teaching her responsibility would hurt her in the long run. Helen and I were trying to help Wendy become a person who could take care of herself. That was love even when it felt like punishment. 3 weeks after the will reading, Brian called me on a Saturday morning. His voice sounded angry, which was unusual for him. He said he drove by the lake property to check on it. He found Wendy there. She was not alone. Dustin was with her. There were 2 other people I did not know. They were inside the house measuring rooms. They had a tape measure and a notebook. They were taking photos of everything. Brian said they were acting like they owned the place, like they were planning renovations or figuring out furniture layouts. He said Wendy saw him pull up, but she did not leave. She just kept doing what she was doing. I told Brian I would meet him there. I got in my car and drove the 40 minutes to the lake. The property sat on 3 acres with old pine trees and a dock that needed repairs. Helen's grandparents built the house in the 1950s. It was small but solid with big windows facing the water. When I pulled up, I saw Dustin's expensive car parked in the gravel driveway next to a truck I did not recognize. Brian was waiting outside. His jaw was tight and his hands were in fists. We walked in together. Wendy was in the kitchen with Dustin and 2 people I had never seen before. One was a woman about Wendy's age with blonde hair. The other was a man in his 40s wearing a polo shirt. They had papers spread out on the counter. The woman was pointing at something and talking about knocking down a wall. Wendy looked up when we came in. She did not look surprised or embarrassed. She looked annoyed, like we were interrupting something important. Brian told them they needed to leave. His voice was calm but firm. Wendy said they were just looking around. She said the property should be split between siblings. She said she had as much right to be there as Brian did. She said it was not fair that he got the whole thing just because he drove Mom to a few appointments. Brian's face got red, but he kept his voice level. He said the property was legally his now. The will was clear. They were trespassing. Wendy laughed like he was joking. She said family could not trespass on family property. I told her she was wrong. This was not family property anymore. It was Brian's property. She needed to leave and take her friends with her. Dustin stood up from where he was sitting. He walked over to Brian and got close to his face. He was trying to intimidate him. He said Brian was being selfish and unreasonable. He said Wendy deserved her share and they were going to make sure she got it. Brian did not move. He just looked at Dustin without blinking. Brian had been doing physical work for 10 years. He was strong and solid and he did not scare easy. He told Dustin he had 10 minutes to pack up and get out, or he was calling the sheriff for trespassing. Dustin said he would like to see him try. Brian pulled out his phone and started dialing. That made Dustin step back. The blonde woman grabbed her purse. The man in the polo shirt started gathering up the papers. Wendy was yelling now. She said we were destroying the family. She said Brian was a traitor and I was a terrible father. She said Mom would be ashamed of both of us. She kept yelling as Dustin pulled her toward the door. They got in their cars and left. The gravel sprayed up as they drove away too fast. Brian and I stood in the empty kitchen. The house felt quiet after all that noise. Brian said he was going to change the locks. I said that was a good idea. When I got home that evening, I thought about my own locks. Wendy had a key to my house. She had one since she was a teenager. I never asked for it back. Marie Darling lived next door. She was in her 70s and spent a lot of time in her garden. She saw everything that happened on our street. The next morning, I was getting my mail when Marie came over. She asked how I was holding up. Then she mentioned something that made my stomach drop. She said she saw someone who looked like Wendy trying my back door a few days ago. It was when I was at the grocery store. The person tried the door and looked in the windows. Marie thought maybe Wendy forgot something and was trying to get it. But now that she thought about it, the person seemed to be checking if anyone was home. I thanked Marie and went inside. I called a locksmith right away. He came that afternoon and changed all the locks. Front door, back door, side door to the garage. I did not tell Wendy I was doing this. I just did it. If she tried to come in while I was gone, she would find out the hard way. The next week, I met with Greg Waite. He was my financial advisor for the past 15 years. Greg helped Helen and me plan for retirement. He knew our whole financial situation. I told him about everything happening with Wendy. I told him about the trespassing and the credit card fraud I suspected was coming. Greg said he had seen family disputes destroy people's retirement plans before. He said we needed to protect my assets. We moved money around. We put some accounts in a trust that Wendy could not touch. We made sure my retirement funds were secure no matter what legal action she might try. Greg said it felt wrong to have to protect yourself from your own child, but he said it was necessary. He had seen too many parents lose everything because they did not want to believe their kids would hurt them financially. A few days later, I started noticing posts on social media. Wendy was putting up vague messages about toxic parents and unfair treatment. She posted about family members who abandon their children when they need help most. She shared articles about inheritance disputes and elder abuse. She was clearly trying to make me look bad. She wanted sympathy from people who did not know the real story. Helen's friends started calling me. They were confused and concerned. They asked what was going on. They said Wendy's post made it sound like I cut her off completely. I had to explain the whole situation over and over. I told them about the will conditions. I told them about Wendy's refusal to work. I told them about the trespassing and the manipulation. Most of Helen's friends understood. They knew Wendy. They had seen her behavior over the years, but explaining it was exhausting. Every phone call felt like I was defending myself for something I should not have to defend. I thought about responding to Wendy's posts publicly, but that would just make things worse. So I let her say what she wanted. The people who mattered knew the truth. Brian called me the next morning. He wanted to talk about Wendy and what we could do. I was sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee when my phone rang. He said maybe we should try a family meeting with someone professional to help. I told him I didn't think it would work. Wendy wasn't interested in listening to anyone. Brian said he knew that was probably true, but he didn't want to give up on her completely. I understood what he meant. She was still our daughter even when she made it hard to remember that. I agreed to try it. Brian said he would look for someone who did this kind of work. A mediator or counselor who helped families talk through problems. I thanked him for trying, even though I felt tired just thinking about it. The mediator's office was in a building downtown near the courthouse. Brian found someone named Dr. Juliana Moore, who worked with families going through estate disputes. We scheduled the meeting for the following Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon. I got there 15 minutes early. Brian arrived right at 2. We sat in the waiting room looking at magazines neither of us actually read. 2:15 came and went. 2:20, 2:30. The receptionist kept glancing at us and then at her computer screen. Finally, at 2:32, Wendy walked in. She didn't apologize for being late. She looked around the waiting room and wrinkled her nose. The mediator came out to get us. Dr. Moore was a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and a calm way of speaking. We followed her into her office. It had 2 couches facing each other and her chair at the end. Wendy sat down and immediately pulled her jacket tighter. She said the office was freezing. Doctor. Moore adjusted the thermostat and asked if that was better. Wendy said it was still cold. Doctor. Moore started explaining how mediation worked. She said we would take turns speaking, and everyone needed to listen without interrupting. Wendy interrupted her to ask how long this would take because she had plans later. Doctor. Moore said it would take as long as we needed. She asked Wendy to please wait her turn to speak. Wendy rolled her eyes but didn't say anything else right then. Doctor. Moore asked each of us to explain our perspective on the situation. Brian went first. He talked about Mom's illness and how hard it was to watch her suffer. He said the inheritance wasn't about money for him. It was about honoring what Mom wanted. Wendy interrupted him 3 times before Dr. Moore had to remind her about the listening rule. When it was Wendy's turn, she talked for 20 minutes straight. She said Brian and I were punishing her for not being the perfect daughter. She said the 5-year work requirement was cruel and unusual. She said Mom would never have wanted this. Dr. Moore asked her what she thought Mom would have wanted. Wendy said Mom would have wanted her to be happy and taken care of. I asked if Mom's wishes only mattered when they benefited Wendy. Dr. Moore held up her hand and reminded us to speak one at a time. Then Wendy said something that made everything click into place. She was talking about Dustin and their plans, and she mentioned they were going to buy a house and a new car. She said Dustin wanted to start a business, and they were going to invest in it together. Dr. Moore asked how much money these plans would cost. Wendy started listing numbers. The house down payment would be $80,000. The car would be $40,000. The business investment would be another $100,000. Dr. Moore looked at her notes where she had written down the estate value. She pointed out that even if Wendy got her full share, it wouldn't cover all those plans. Wendy's face went red. She said there was enough money if it was split fairly. I realized right then that she had been lying to Dustin about how much money existed. She probably told him we had twice as much as we really did. That explained why Dustin was so angry and aggressive. He thought there was more money and that I was keeping it from them. Doctor. Moore asked Wendy what kind of work she might be interested in. She said it in a gentle way, like she was trying to help Wendy think about options. Wendy looked at her like she had asked something offensive. She said she wasn't interested in any kind of work. She said working was for people who didn't have better options. She said she had been raised to expect better than a minimum wage job. Brian laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh exactly, but it was loud and sudden. Wendy turned on him and demanded to know what was funny. Brian said her attitude was funny. He said plenty of people worked hard jobs and had good lives. He said Mom worked as a nurse for 30 years, and she never thought she was too good for it. Wendy said that was different. Doctor. Moore looked shocked. I could see it on her face even though she was trying to stay neutral. She asked Wendy to clarify what she meant by people without better options. Wendy said some people were meant to work, and some people were meant to do other things. Doctor. Moore asked what other things Wendy was meant to do. Wendy didn't have an answer for that. I tried to explain that Helen and I created the work requirement because we wanted Wendy to be independent. We wanted her to be able to take care of herself. We didn't want to punish her. We wanted to help her build a real life. Wendy cut me off before I could finish. She said the best way to help her would be to give her the money now, so she could make her own choices. She said treating her like a child was insulting. Doctor. Moore said something then that I appreciated. She said that in her experience, giving large amounts of money to people without financial skills or responsibility usually ended badly. She said the money disappeared quickly, and the person was left in the same situation or worse. Wendy said that was a judgmental thing to say. Doctor. Moore said it wasn't judgment. It was observation based on many cases she had seen. Wendy stood up and said this whole thing was a waste of time. She said we were all against her and nothing was going to change. She grabbed her purse and walked out. Doctor. Moore called after her, but Wendy kept going. We heard the outside door slam shut. Doctor. Moore sat back in her chair and let out a long breath. She asked Brian and me to stay for a few more minutes. She said she wanted to talk to us privately. We both nodded. Doctor. And Moore said she had been doing family mediation for 15 years. She said she had seen many cases like this where adult children felt entitled to their parents' money. She said sometimes people needed to hit rock bottom before they were willing to change. She said it was hard to watch, but sometimes it was necessary. I asked her if she thought Wendy would ever change. Doctor. Moore said she couldn't predict that. She said change required the person to want it, and right now Wendy didn't want it. She was still looking for shortcuts and easy answers. Brian asked if there was anything else we could do. Doctor. Moore said we were already doing it. We were holding boundaries and letting Wendy face consequences. She said that was the hardest and most loving thing parents could do sometimes. 2 days later, my phone rang at 9 in the morning. It was Wendy. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. I asked her what happened. She said Dustin broke up with her. He sent her a text message the night before saying they were done. I asked why. She said he found out about the real amount of the inheritance. She said he called her a liar and said he wasted 2 years on her. She was sobbing into the phone asking me what she should do. I felt bad for her. I really did. But I also noticed she was crying about losing Dustin. She wasn't crying about her behavior or about our family or about anything she had done. She was crying because a man left her. I told her she could come over and we could talk. She asked if I would change the will conditions. I said no. She hung up on me. An hour later, she called back. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail. Her voice was different now. Not sad, angry. She said this was all my fault. She said if I had just given her the money like a normal parent, none of this would have happened. She said Dustin would still be with her and they would be happy. She said she would never forgive me for ruining her relationship. She said I was a terrible father and Mom would be ashamed of me. Then she hung up. I saved the voicemail. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I might need it later as proof of something. Brian came over that weekend to help me fix a leaking pipe under the kitchen sink. While we were working, he mentioned his friend Jerome. Jerome Appleby worked with Brian doing electrical work. Brian said Jerome's sister managed a company that was hiring. They had entry-level positions open with good benefits and training programs. Brian said he told Jerome about Wendy's situation. Jerome said his sister would be willing to interview Wendy if she was interested. Brian gave the information to a mutual friend who knew Wendy. The friend was supposed to pass it along. A week went by, then 2 weeks. Wendy never called Jerome's sister. She never followed up. Brian checked with Jerome, who checked with his sister. No application, no phone call, nothing. I wasn't surprised, but I was disappointed. Thanksgiving was coming up. I couldn't imagine being in the house without Helen. Every corner reminded me of her. The kitchen where she cooked. The living room where she read. The bedroom we shared for 31 years. Brian called and asked if I wanted to spend Thanksgiving at his apartment instead. He said we could cook something simple and just be together. I said yes immediately. I also called Wendy and left a message inviting her. Brian sent her a text with the same invitation. She didn't respond to either of us. Thursday came. I drove to Brian's apartment with a bag of groceries. He lived in a small 2-bedroom place across town. It was clean and organized, very much like him. We cooked a turkey breast and mashed potatoes and green beans. Nothing fancy. We set the table and sat down to eat. Brian raised his glass of water and said we should talk about Mom. He said we should remember the good things. I agreed. We spent the next hour sharing stories. I talked about how Helen used to sing while she cooked, even though she couldn't carry a tune. Brian talked about how she always knew when he was upset, even when he tried to hide it. We laughed and we cried and we ate our simple meal. Neither of us mentioned Wendy. We both knew she wasn't coming. We both knew she had made her choice. But for those few hours, we focused on what we had instead of what we lost. The day after Thanksgiving, Marie knocked on my door holding a glass casserole dish wrapped in a checkered towel. She lived 3 houses down and had brought food over twice since Helen died, always with that same careful knock that said she didn't want to intrude, but wanted to help. I invited her in, and she set the dish on the counter, pulled back the towel to show chicken and rice with vegetables baked into the top. She said it was her mother's recipe, and froze well if I wanted to save some for later. I thanked her and asked if she wanted coffee. She said yes and sat at the kitchen table while I got mugs down from the cabinet. We sat across from each other and she asked how I was doing with everything. I told her about Thanksgiving with Brian, about the simple meal and the stories about Helen. She nodded and said that sounded nice. Then she told me about her own daughter who had stolen money from her purse for years to buy drugs. She said it took her a long time to stop giving her daughter chances and start letting her face what happened when she made bad choices. She said the hardest part was watching someone you love struggle and knowing you couldn't fix it for them. She said sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let people face the natural results of their actions, even when every part of you wants to rescue them. I asked how her daughter was doing now. Marie said she had been clean for 3 years and had a job and an apartment. She said it took hitting bottom before her daughter was willing to change, and if Marie had kept bailing her out, her daughter might still be using. We sat there for almost an hour talking about difficult family relationships and how love doesn't always look like helping. When she left, I put the casserole in the refrigerator and felt less alone than I had in weeks. The first week of December, I went to see Carrie for my regular appointment. I sat in the chair across from her desk and she asked how the holiday went. I told her about Brian's apartment and the meal and the stories. She asked if I felt sad. I said yes, but it was a different kind of sad than I expected. She asked what I meant. I said I thought I would spend the whole day missing Helen and feeling the empty space where she should have been. Instead, I felt grateful for the years we had and for Brian being there with me. Carrie wrote something in her notebook and asked about Wendy. I said Wendy didn't come and didn't respond to our invitations. Carrie asked how that made me feel. I realized I felt more disappointed than angry, which was new. She asked what else I was feeling. That's when it hit me that Christmas was coming, and it would be the first one without Helen in 31 years. My throat got tight and my eyes started burning. Carrie handed me the tissue box from her desk. She said it was okay to cry. I said I hadn't really cried about Helen dying because I had been too busy dealing with Wendy and the will and all the conflict. She said grief doesn't follow a schedule, and sometimes it shows up when you least expect it. I sat there in her office and cried for the first time since Helen's funeral. I cried about losing my wife, and about 31 Christmases together, and about how she would never meet Brian's future children. I cried about the mornings without her, and the empty side of the bed, and the way the house felt too quiet. Carrie sat there and let me cry without trying to fix it or make it better. When I finally stopped, she said I had been carrying anger at Wendy as a way to avoid feeling the grief underneath. She said now that I was letting myself feel the loss, I might find it easier to deal with Wendy without so much rage. I left her office feeling exhausted but also lighter, like I had been holding my breath for months and finally let it out. A week before Christmas, a card showed up in my mailbox with Wendy's return address. The envelope was red with gold trim and had my name and address printed in generic computer font. I opened it and found a card with a picture of a snowman on the front. Inside was a pre-printed message about wishing joy and peace during the holiday season. No personal note, no signature in her handwriting, just the printed message and her name at the bottom that looked like it came from the same computer print job as the envelope. It felt like the kind of card you send to someone you barely know because you have to, not because you want to. I set it on the counter and stared at it for a while. It seemed like such a small, mean gesture, like she was checking a box to say she acknowledged my existence but couldn't be bothered to write an actual message. That evening, Brian called and mentioned he hadn't gotten a Christmas card from Wendy. His voice sounded casual, but I could hear the hurt underneath. He said it didn't matter and he wasn't expecting anything from her anyway. I told him about my card with the pre-printed message. He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. He said at least I got something, even if it was basically nothing. We talked for a few more minutes and then he had to go. After I hung up, I looked at the card again and thought about how Wendy managed to make even a Christmas card feel like an insult. 2 days before Christmas, I made an appointment with someone at the community college to talk about setting up a scholarship fund. I drove to the campus and found the development office in the administration building. The woman I met with was maybe 50 with gray hair pulled back in a clip. She asked what kind of fund I wanted to create. I told her about Helen and her 3 years fighting cancer and all the nurses and technicians who took care of her. I said I wanted to set up a scholarship for students pursuing healthcare careers. She asked how much I was thinking of funding it with. I said I could start with $10,000 and add to it over time. She smiled and said that would help several students every year. We spent an hour going over paperwork and details about how the fund would work and who would be eligible. She asked what I wanted to call it. I said the Helen Shaw Memorial Scholarship. She wrote that down and said they would have everything ready to finalize in January. I left feeling like I had done something useful with the money, instead of letting it become another thing for Wendy to fight about. It felt like a better way to honor Helen than anything else I could think of. She had always believed in helping people and in education making a difference. This seemed like something she would have wanted. The third week of January, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and a woman said she was calling from my credit card company about some unusual charges. She asked if I had recently used my card to pay for rent at an apartment complex across town. I said no. She asked if I had authorized anyone else to use my account. I said no again. She read off 3 charges totaling almost $2,000, all to the same apartment complex over the past 3 months. I felt my stomach drop because I knew exactly what had happened. I asked her to send me the details by email. She said she would and that I should file a fraud report. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table trying to figure out how Wendy got my card number. Then I remembered years ago when she lived with us, she used to borrow my card to buy things online. She must have memorized the number back then. The email came through with the charge details and the apartment address. I looked up the complex online, and it was the same place where Wendy lived with Dustin before he left her. She was using my card to pay her rent because she had no job and no other way to cover it. It was theft, but it was also a sign of how desperate she had become. I printed out the email and put it in a folder with all the other documentation I had been keeping about Wendy's behavior. The next morning, I drove to the police station and asked to file a report. The officer at the desk directed me to a detective who handled fraud cases. I sat across from him and explained what happened with the credit card charges. He asked if I knew who used the card. I said yes, my daughter. He looked up from his notepad and asked if I wanted to press charges. I said I wanted to create a paper trail to protect myself from future charges, but I didn't necessarily want her arrested. He nodded like he understood and said family financial abuse was more common than people think. He said a lot of adult children steal from their parents and the parents feel too guilty to report it. He took down all the information and had me sign the report. He said the credit card company would investigate and I wouldn't be responsible for the fraudulent charges. He also said having the police report on file would make it harder for Wendy to claim she had permission to use the card. I thanked him and left with a copy of the report in my hand. It felt strange to have official documentation of my daughter stealing from me, but it also felt necessary. That afternoon, my phone rang and Wendy's name showed up on the screen. I answered, and she immediately started screaming about the police report. She said I was trying to ruin her life and destroy her future. She said what kind of father calls the police on his own daughter. I waited for her to stop yelling, and then I told her she ruined her own situation by stealing from me. I said I would drop the report if she paid back what she took and got professional help for whatever was going on with her. She said she didn't need help and I was the one with the problem. She said I was cruel and vindictive and Mom would be ashamed of me. I told her Mom would be ashamed of her for stealing and lying and refusing to work. She hung up on me. I sat there holding the phone and feeling tired. Every conversation with Wendy ended the same way now, with her blaming me for consequences she created herself. In February, Brian called to tell me he got a promotion at work. He sounded excited but also a little guilty. He said he would be supervising a crew now and making quite a bit more money with better benefits. I congratulated him and asked why he sounded guilty about it. He said it felt wrong to be doing well when Wendy was struggling so much. I told him that was misplaced guilt. I said he earned his promotion through years of hard work and showing up every day and being reliable. I said Wendy was struggling because she refused to work, not because of anything Brian did or didn't do. He was quiet for a moment and then said he knew I was right, but it still felt strange. I told him he should be proud of himself and celebrate his success. I said Helen would be incredibly proud of him. He said thanks and his voice got a little thick like he might cry. We talked for a few more minutes about his new responsibilities, and then he had to go. After I hung up, I felt grateful that at least one of my children understood how to build a life through actual effort. The following week, I met with Greg at his office to talk about setting up a trust for what remained of Helen's estate. I explained that I wanted to remove myself from direct control of the money so Wendy couldn't manipulate me emotionally about it. Greg said that was smart planning and would also protect the assets legally. He walked me through how a trust worked and how a third party would manage the funds according to the terms Helen and I had set. He said it would take a few weeks to get everything established, but once it was done, I wouldn't have to deal with constant pressure from Wendy about money. I signed the paperwork and felt a huge sense of relief. The boundary was finally in place in a way that couldn't be argued with or worked around. Greg shook my hand and said he thought I was handling a difficult situation with a lot of wisdom. I thanked him and left his office feeling lighter than I had in months. At my next appointment with Carrie, she suggested I try volunteering at a grief support group she ran on Thursday evenings. She said sharing my experience with others who lost spouses might help me process my own loss in new ways. I was hesitant at first because I didn't think I had anything useful to offer other people. She said sometimes just being present and listening was enough. I agreed to try it once. That Thursday, I showed up at the community center where the group met. There were 8 people sitting in a circle of folding chairs. Carrie introduced me and I sat down. For the next hour, I listened to other people talk about losing their husbands and wives. Some of them had been widowed for years. Some of them lost their spouses recently, like me. I didn't say much that first night, but hearing their stories made me feel less alone. The next week, I went back and shared a little about Helen and how hard it was to deal with family conflict while grieving. Several people nodded like they understood exactly what I meant. One woman said her son had tried to take her car after her husband died because he thought she was too old to drive. Another man said his daughter-in-law kept pressuring him to sell his house and move in with them so they could rent out his property. I realized my situation with Wendy wasn't unique. Other people dealt with family members who saw grief as an opportunity instead of a time to offer support. I kept going back every Thursday and found that helping other people by listening to their stories actually helped me understand my own grief better. Marie brought me to her first book club meeting on a Thursday evening in February. The group met at a community center room that smelled like coffee and old paper. 8 women sat in a circle of mismatched chairs, and they all looked up when we walked in. Marie introduced me as her neighbor who had recently lost his wife. They nodded with understanding faces and made space for me to sit down. The book that month was something about a man hiking a trail after his divorce. I hadn't read it, but they told me to just listen and see if I liked the group. For the next hour, they talked about the book and about their own lives. 2 of them were widows. 3 were divorced. One woman's husband had dementia and didn't recognize her anymore. They talked about books, but they also talked about loneliness and learning to do things alone. Nobody asked me about money or inheritance or family drama. Nobody needed anything from me. When the meeting ended, one of the widows handed me a copy of next month's book and said she hoped I'd come back. I took it home and actually started reading it that night. In March, my phone rang with Wendy's number. I almost didn't answer because our conversations usually ended badly. But I picked up on the 4th ring. She told me she got a job as a receptionist at a dental office downtown. Her voice had this edge to it like she was waiting for me to throw a parade. She described the office and the dentist and how she'd answered phones and scheduled appointments for 2 whole days already. I could hear her expecting me to say she'd done something amazing. I told her I was glad she was taking a first step. She went quiet for a second, then asked if this meant the 5-year clock started now. I said yes, as long as she kept the job. She said of course she would keep it, like the question insulted her. Then she asked if I wanted to take her out to dinner to celebrate. I said maybe after she'd been there a month. She hung up without saying goodbye. Wendy called again 2 weeks later. Her voice was different this time, higher and faster. She said her boss at the dental office was impossible to work with. She said he expected her to arrive exactly at 8:30 every morning, even though traffic was unpredictable. She said he got mad when she didn't file patient records in the right order, even though nobody had properly trained her on the system. She said the other receptionist was rude and unhelpful. She said she quit that morning and walked out. I didn't argue with her. I just said the 5-year clock hadn't really started because she needed to maintain employment, not just try it for 2 weeks. She said I was changing the rules. I said the rule was always 5 consecutive years of full-time work. She said this was impossible and unfair. I said lots of people manage to keep jobs even when bosses are difficult. She hung up on me again. Brian called me in early April to tell me he was seeing someone. Her name was Lisa, and she was a teacher at the elementary school near his work. He met her through Jerome, who apparently had a sister who worked at the same school. Brian said they'd been on 4 dates and he really liked her. He sounded nervous telling me this, like he thought I might disapprove or think it was too soon after Helen's death. I told him I was happy for him and asked when I could meet her. He said, "Really, you want to meet her already?" I said, "Of course I did." He set up dinner at a casual restaurant for the following Saturday. Lisa showed up in jeans and a sweater, shaking my hand firmly and looking me right in the eye. She asked me questions about my work and my life without being nosy. She laughed at Brian's stories and touched his arm when she talked to him. She didn't act like she was trying to impress me or win me over. She just acted normal and kind. When Brian went to the bathroom, she told me she'd heard about Helen and she was sorry for my loss. Then she said Brian talked about his mom a lot, and she could tell how much he loved her. I liked her immediately. 2 days after that dinner, Brian forwarded me a message from Wendy. It was long and rambling. She said she saw on social media that Brian was dating someone. She said he was replacing the family with strangers. She said he was moving on too fast and forgetting about mom. She said he should be focusing on family instead of new relationships. She said Lisa probably just wanted his money, which was funny since Brian didn't have any money beyond his regular paycheck. She said Brian was being selfish and disloyal. Brian's message to me just said, "Is she serious right now?" I wrote back that Wendy was projecting her own isolation onto him. He sent back a thumbs up. In late April, Brian asked if I wanted to spend a weekend at the lake property with him and Lisa. They wanted to do some repairs and cleaning before summer. I said yes and drove up on Saturday morning. The property looked good. Brian had been taking care of it since the will reading, cutting the grass and checking the pipes. We spent the day fixing a loose board on the dock and cleaning out the gutters. Lisa pulled weeds from the flower beds that Helen used to maintain. We worked without talking much, just enjoying the quiet and the fresh air. That evening we sat on the porch and watched the sun go down over the water. Lisa asked me about Helen's family and how long they'd owned this place. I told her about Helen's grandparents building the cabin in the 1950s and how Helen had spent every summer here as a kid. I told her how much Helen loved this spot and how she'd wanted it to stay in the family. Lisa said she could see why. Being there felt peaceful instead of sad. It felt like honoring Helen's memory the right way. At my next appointment with Carrie, I told her about Wendy's message to Brian and about the weekend at the lake. She asked how I was handling the guilt about Wendy struggling while Brian was doing well. I said I didn't feel that guilty anymore. I said Wendy was making her own choices and I couldn't fix them for her. Carrie nodded and said that was growth. Then she said something that stuck with me. She said I could love Wendy while also recognizing that she was making choices I couldn't fix. She said it was a hard balance between compassion and enabling. She said giving Wendy money now wouldn't help her learn to support herself. She said the employment requirement was actually the most loving thing I could do, even if Wendy couldn't see it that way. I sat with that for a while. It helped me feel less like a bad father. In May, Wendy called to tell me she got another job at a call center. She said it was boring work, but the pay was okay. She said she was going to prove she could do this. I said that was great and I hoped it worked out. She stayed there for 6 weeks. Then she called again, this time angry. She said she quit because another worker had been rude to her and management didn't do anything about it. She said the woman had made comments about Wendy's work speed and her phone manner. She said she wasn't going to tolerate being disrespected. Then she said she'd kept the job for 6 weeks and I should be proud of that. I said 6 weeks was better than 2 weeks, but it still wasn't sustained employment. She said I was being unreasonable. I told Wendy I could see she was trying, but she needed to learn to stay employed even when things got difficult. I said the 5-year requirement wasn't just about having a job, it was about proving she could handle the normal challenges that come with working. I said every job has difficult coworkers and frustrating situations. She said I was moving the goalposts. I said I wasn't. I was just being realistic about what sustained employment actually meant. She said this whole thing was designed to make her fail. I said it was designed to help her succeed by building real skills. She said I didn't understand how hard it was for her. I said I understood it was hard, but hard didn't mean impossible. She hung up. Brian called me in mid-June. His voice was shaking with excitement. He said he'd proposed to Lisa at the lake house that afternoon. He said they'd been walking on the dock and he just asked her. She said yes. They were getting married. I felt this rush of happiness for him mixed with this ache that Helen wasn't here to see it. I told him congratulations and that I was so happy for them both. He said he wished Mom could have met Lisa. I said Mom would have loved her. We talked for a few more minutes about wedding plans and timing. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and cried. But they were good tears mixed with sad ones. My son had found someone who made him happy. That was something worth celebrating, even if it hurt that Helen missed it. Brian and Lisa posted photos from their engagement party on Saturday afternoon. I saw them while scrolling through my phone after dinner. The backyard was decorated with white lights and flowers. There were maybe 30 people in the pictures, all of them smiling and holding glasses up to toast the couple. Lisa's parents were there. Jerome and some other guys from Brian's work crew were there. I was there in several of the photos, standing next to Brian with my arm around his shoulders. Wendy was not there. Brian had made that decision himself. He told me about it 3 days before the party when he came over to help me fix a leaky faucet in the kitchen. He said he couldn't have Wendy there after everything that happened. He said he wanted one day that was just about celebrating something good without worrying about drama or confrontation. I told him it was his day and his choice, and I supported whatever he decided. Around 8 that night, my phone started buzzing with text messages from Wendy. She had seen the photos, too. The first message asked why she wasn't invited. The second message said it was unfair to exclude her from family events. The third message called me a terrible father for allowing this to happen. The fourth message said Brian was being cruel and petty. The messages kept coming for the next hour, each one angrier than the last. She said she was part of this family whether Brian liked it or not. She said she had every right to be at her brother's engagement party. She said I should have forced Brian to include her. I didn't respond to any of the messages. I put my phone on silent and went to bed. Gerald's office looked the same as it did the day of the will reading. Same wooden desk, same leather chairs, same bookshelf full of legal volumes that probably nobody ever read. I sat across from him on a Wednesday morning in July and told him I wanted to update my own will. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and clicked his pen. I told him I wanted to make the language about Wendy's employment requirement even clearer than it already was. I wanted it to specify that the 5 years had to be consecutive. I wanted it to say that any gap in employment longer than 2 weeks would reset the clock back to 0. I wanted it to say that part-time work didn't count. Gerald wrote all of this down without looking up. Then I told him I wanted to add a section that protected Brian's inheritance no matter what happened with Wendy. I wanted it to say that if I died before Wendy completed her 5 years, Brian still got the lake property and his full share of whatever money was left. I wanted it to say that Wendy's failure to meet the employment requirement couldn't reduce what Brian received. Gerald nodded and kept writing. He said these were all reasonable additions. He said he could have the updated will ready for signature within a week. He asked if there was anything else I wanted to change. I thought about it for a minute. Then I told him to add a section about the house. I said if I had to go into a nursing home or needed expensive medical care, the house could be sold to pay for it. But if there was anything left after I died, that money should be split between Brian and Wendy only if Wendy had met the employment requirement. If she hadn't, it all went to Brian. Gerald finished writing and looked up at me. He said this will was going to be very difficult for Wendy to challenge in court. I said that was exactly the point. Marie and I started meeting for coffee every Thursday morning at a place 2 blocks from my house. She was 73 and had been a widow for 5 years. Her husband died of a heart attack while mowing the lawn. She found him face down in the grass with the mower still running next to him. She told me this story during our 3rd coffee meeting, and I told her about Helen's 3 years of cancer and how I watched her fade away piece by piece. We both cried a little bit that morning, right there in the coffee shop with people walking past our table. After that, we talked about other things. She told me about her 2 sons who both lived out of state and called her once a month if she was lucky. I told her about Brian and Wendy and the whole inheritance situation. She listened without judging. She said her own kids had fought over her husband's life insurance money, even though there wasn't much of it. She said money made people crazy sometimes. We talked about books we were reading and shows we were watching on television. We talked about our gardens and our neighbors and what we were making for dinner that week. It was nice to have someone to talk to who understood what it felt like to lose a partner after decades together. Someone who knew that you could be lonely even when you weren't alone. Neither of us wanted romance. We both said that clearly one Thursday when the subject came up. We just wanted company. We just wanted someone who got it. Wendy called me on a Tuesday in August. Her voice sounded different. Less angry, more tired. She said she got a job at a grocery store stocking shelves and running the register. She said the pay was okay and the hours were steady. She said she'd been there for 2 weeks already. I told her that was good. I told her I hoped it worked out. She was quiet for a few seconds. Then she said she was really going to try this time. She said she knew she needed to do this. I didn't say anything about the 5-year requirement. I didn't remind her that 2 weeks was just the beginning. I just told her I was glad she was working. Over the next few months, Wendy called less often. When she did call, she complained less. She told me about her coworkers and her manager and the customers who came through her line. She told me about the employee discount and how she was saving a little bit of money each week. By the end of October, she'd been at the job for 3 months. This was longer than she'd ever kept any job before. I wanted to feel hopeful about it. I wanted to believe she was finally changing. But I'd seen her quit too many times to get my hopes up too much. I just waited to see what would happen. Brian and Lisa came over for dinner on a Sunday in late September. We ate chicken and vegetables at the kitchen table, and then Lisa pulled out her phone to show me something. It was a website for a wedding venue about 40 minutes away. Big white barn, green fields, string lights hanging between trees. She scrolled through photos of couples getting married there, all of them smiling in front of that barn. Brian said they'd visited the place last weekend and really liked it. He said they wanted to set a date for next April. Spring wedding. Lisa's mom was already talking about flowers and decorations. Brian asked if I would help with the planning. He said they didn't have a lot of money for a big fancy wedding, but they wanted it to be nice. I told them I would help however I could. I told them Helen would have loved to be part of this. Brian's eyes got wet when I said that. Lisa reached across the table and squeezed my hand. After they left, I sat in the living room for a long time thinking about Helen. Thinking about how she would have been so excited about this wedding. How she would have been making lists and calling vendors and probably driving Brian and Lisa crazy with suggestions. I missed her so much in that moment it felt like I couldn't breathe. But I also felt something else. Something like purpose. Something like being needed for something good instead of just dealing with problems. Wendy sent me a text message in the middle of September. It said she wanted to come to Brian's wedding. It said she knew she hadn't been invited to the engagement party, but she hoped she could be there for the actual wedding. She said she was still working at the grocery store and doing better. I called Brian and told him about the message. He was quiet for a while. Then he said Wendy could come if she was still employed when the wedding happened and if she agreed to behave herself. No drama, no scenes, no making the day about her. I texted Wendy back and told her what Brian said. She responded within minutes. She said she would still be working. She said she would behave. She said thank you for giving her a chance. I didn't respond to that last message. I just hoped she meant it. I started going through Helen's closet on a Saturday morning in early October. Marie came over to help. We pulled out dresses and sweaters and shoes, making piles on the bed. Keep pile, donate pile, throw away pile. Helen had kept everything. Clothes from 20 years ago that didn't fit anymore but she couldn't let go of. Shoes she never wore but thought she might need someday. Scarves and belts and purses she'd collected over 3 decades. Marie held up a blue dress and asked if I remembered it. I did. Helen wore it to Brian's high school graduation. She wore it to Wendy's adoption finalization hearing at the courthouse. She wore it to our 25th anniversary dinner. I put it in the keep pile. We went through everything slowly. Marie told me stories about sorting through her husband's things after he died. How she kept his favorite jacket for 2 years before she could finally donate it. How she still had his wedding ring in a box in her dresser. We both cried several times that afternoon. But it felt good to finally do this. To finally let go of things that were just things. To keep the items that really mattered and let the rest go to people who could use them. November came, and Wendy hit 6 months at the grocery store. And 6 months was longer than she'd ever been employed in her entire adult life. Her manager, whose name I learned was Tom, mentioned this to me one day when I was shopping there. He said Wendy wasn't perfect, but she showed up on time and did her work. He said she'd gotten better at dealing with difficult customers over the past few months. He said he hoped she'd stick around. I thanked him for giving her a chance. Wendy seemed different when I talked to her now. Still not apologetic about everything that happened after Helen's death. Still not warm or close with me, but less angry, less bitter, more focused on just getting through each day. I didn't know if this would last. I didn't know if she'd make it to 5 years. But 6 months was something. 6 months was more than I expected back in June when Gerald read the will. Brian and Lisa and I spent Thanksgiving at my house. Lisa's parents came too. Her sister and brother-in-law. Their 2 kids who were 7 and 9 and ran around the house like they owned it. We cooked turkey and stuffing and all the traditional things Helen used to make. I set a place at the table for Helen with her favorite flowers in a small vase. Nobody said anything about it at first. Then Lisa's mom asked who the extra place was for. I told them it was for Helen. I told them I wanted her to be part of this day even though she couldn't be here. Brian started crying. Then Lisa started crying. Then I started crying. Lisa's dad cleared his throat and said that was a beautiful thing to do. We all sat down and ate together. We told stories about Helen. Lisa's family shared memories of people they'd lost too. The kids asked questions about heaven and what happens when people die. It was sad and hard and also somehow good. It felt like honoring Helen properly. It felt like moving forward while still holding on to what mattered. My phone rang at 7 that evening while I was putting away leftovers. It was Wendy. She said she wanted to tell me she was still working. She said she'd worked her shift that morning and would be back on Friday. She said she knew today was hard without Mom, and she just wanted to check in. We talked for maybe 5 minutes. Short conversation, nothing deep. But it was civil. It was calm. It was the first time in months we'd talked without anger or accusations or demands. When we hung up, I stood in the kitchen holding my phone and feeling something I hadn't felt about Wendy in a long time. Not hope, exactly. But maybe the beginning of hope. Maybe the start of something better than what we'd had. December came with the kind of cold that made everything feel sharper. I started going to Helen's grave every Sunday morning with fresh flowers from the grocery store where Wendy worked. The first Sunday I went alone and stood there for maybe 20 minutes just talking to the headstone like Helen could hear me. I told her about Brian's engagement and about Wendy keeping her job for 6 months now. I told her I missed her every single day and that the house felt too quiet without her. The second Sunday, Marie asked if she could come with me. She brought flowers for her husband's grave, which was 3 rows over from Helen's. We walked between the graves together, and she told me stories about her marriage and how long it took before she could visit without crying the whole time. I told her I was still at the crying stage. She said that was okay and normal and I shouldn't rush myself. We made it a routine after that. Every Sunday morning at 9, we'd meet at the cemetery entrance with our flowers. Sometimes we'd talk about our spouses and sometimes we'd just walk in comfortable silence. Marie understood grief in a way most people didn't, because she'd lived through it herself. She told me once that she learned to build a life that honored her husband's memory, while still moving forward into whatever came next. I asked her how long that took, and she said she'd tell me when she figured it out completely. The holidays came, and Wendy kept showing up for her shifts at the grocery store. I ran into her manager Tom one afternoon when I was buying milk and bread. He recognized me from previous conversations and stopped to tell me Wendy had picked up extra shifts during the busy season. He said she wasn't perfect, and sometimes got frustrated with difficult customers, but she showed up on time and did her work. He said that was more than he could say for some employees he'd had for years. I thanked him for giving her a chance and for being patient while she learned. He waved off the thanks and said Wendy was earning her place there, and he hoped she'd stick around. I left the store feeling something I hadn't felt about Wendy in months. Not quite pride, but maybe the start of it. Maybe the beginning of believing she could actually do this. Winter turned to spring, and Brian and Lisa set their wedding date for April at the lake house. They wanted Helen's favorite flowers everywhere, and they wanted the ceremony outside by the water where Helen used to sit every summer evening. I helped them plan everything and watched Brian become more excited than I'd seen him since before Helen got sick. Lisa's family pitched in too, and it felt good to be part of something joyful instead of just managing grief and conflict. 3 weeks before the wedding, Brian called Wendy and told her she could come if she was still employed and if she agreed to behave appropriately. Wendy said yes to both conditions. Brian told me about the conversation, and I could hear in his voice that he wanted to believe his sister could show up and be part of something good. I wanted to believe it too, even though I was scared to hope too much. The wedding day came with perfect weather and clear skies. Wendy arrived early and actually helped Lisa's sister set up chairs and hang flowers. She wore a simple blue dress and kept her phone in her purse instead of checking it constantly like she usually did. The ceremony was beautiful, and I cried through most of it thinking about how Helen should have been there to see this. When it came time for toasts, I stood up with my glass and talked about Helen and how she taught us all what real love looked like through her actions and her choices. I welcomed Lisa to our family and told her that Helen would have loved her for making Brian so happy. I meant every single word about building something good from loss and moving forward while carrying the people we loved with us. Wendy didn't cause any problems. She didn't complain or make demands or turn attention to herself. She just participated like a normal family member, and it felt like a small miracle. A year after Helen died, I sat on the porch of our house watching Brian and Lisa plant a garden in the side yard. They'd decided to create something living to remember Helen by, and chose all her favorite flowers and herbs. Lisa dug holes while Brian carefully placed each plant and packed soil around the roots. They worked together with easy coordination, and I could see the life they were building together. Wendy was still at the grocery store 9 months into her job now. She called once a week to check in, and our conversations stayed short but civil. She hadn't apologized for her behavior after Helen's death, and we weren't close the way we'd been when she was younger. But she was showing up and doing the work, and slowly rebuilding trust through consistent action instead of empty promises. I missed Helen with an ache that never fully went away. Some mornings I still reached for her side of the bed before remembering she wasn't there. Some evenings I started to call her name before catching myself, but I could finally see that the inheritance conditions Helen and I created together weren't about punishment or control. They were about giving our daughter the push she needed to build a real life instead of waiting around for other people to die. The grief was still there every single day, but hope was there too now. Hope that Wendy might actually make it to 5 years. Hope that Brian and Lisa would build something lasting together. Hope that I could figure out how to live the rest of my life in a way that honored everything Helen and I built together. I thought Helen would be proud of how we were all finding our way forward, even though the path looked different from any of us expected.